So gibberish.
This, I have made a little mistake in filling this form. I was sworn in on Damian, Illinois. I sent you out a letter when he was applying for a pension.
That's in the 19th century.
This would have been about 1910.
1910.
What's the word beside Arranmore?
Tories. I spelled it with.
Hello everybody, and thanks for coming to the talk this evening. I'm very pleased to welcome Damian Shiels here. He's come from according to his Twitter bio. So he's got a long list of qualifications, and he specialises in American Civil War history. He's got a website called Forgotten Irish. We can put some links up if you're on Twitter. His handle is there. And his website is IrishAmericanCivilWar.com. We're also live streaming the talk on YouTube, so people who can't make it this evening are able to watch it from abroad. A few people were asking about that. So he's going to be talking about Paddy Nojeen Gallagher, and he's related to Mickey Faggy or Mickey Vigil, who is from the Afford side of the island. It's just about a mile over this direction for anybody who doesn't know the island that well. I'll show you some of his family connections. He's got relations probably through all the Valentes would be related to ourselves through my mum's side. So we have a lot of connections on the island still. He doesn't have many direct descendants because there wasn't much of a family. He was related to Paddy Edward Gallagher, who you'll probably know from the Arranmore disaster. You've probably heard of him. So without further ado, Paddy did, without sort of spoiling the story, did survive the war and is buried on the island. He spent his last days living in Mickey's house on the island. So thanks, Damian.
Cheers, Seamus. Thanks everyone for coming along. We're on the ferry out. I was saying it's strange for the American Civil War can take a nice journey out on the boat to Arranmore. The islands actually generally, I've done other bits, Bear Island, Achill Island, all of them have American Civil War veterans, a lot of whom died. But what I'm going to do today, this is actually the first time I've ever given a lecture just on a specific individual who wasn't incredibly famous, like a general or something where there's loads of information on him. A lot of what we're going to be doing is looking based on Paddy's pension file. So I tried to kind of reconstruct his American Civil War service and the types of things he went through before he came back here. And it was something that would have affected him incredibly, both mentally and physically, throughout the remainder of his life. Interesting to consider when we're thinking about him. But I want to give you a bit of background as well at the end. I've been working for a few weeks now in my spare time to try and pull together a map of Donegal and the American Civil War, which identifies people to specific parts of the county who are involved in the conflict in some way, and that map has gone live, so I'm kind of using this as a bit of a launch event as well. So if we have a couple of minutes at the end, I'll show you that. There's about 200 entries for Donegal individuals in the war. But I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction at the start. And I always call it Ireland's Forgotten Great War because it is a conflict that we have completely forgotten in a way that we have not done, for example, with the First World War. So more men from this county fought and died in the American Civil War than any other modern conflict. We probably have to go back to the days of Red Huron to get the proportion of the population who were involved in military conflict, as in this. But of course, they were all immigrants. So there's very few people who are directly descended to these people left today in the county. A lot of the way we engage with history tends to be through genealogy. The First World War commemorations as well had an awful big tie-in as a kind of a major European event, I think, which made them fairly attractive. But we failed miserably in any efforts we've had to try and look in any serious detail at these people. But the numbers are huge. Somewhere in the region of 250,000 ethnic Irishmen served in just the Union forces in the American Civil War. If you'd been walking down Manhattan when the American Civil War broke out, 1 in every 4 of the people you would have met on the street had been born in Ireland. This isn't ethnically Irish, they're people who have been born here. So their children in this period of time when there was a lot of, for example, anti-Catholic prejudice in the United States, a lot of them would have seen themselves as ethnically Irish. A lot of Irish who had been born into Irish communities in Scotland, where Donegal had big ties even in this period of the 19th century, in England, who subsequently emigrate to the United States, Canada, are all part of this ethnic mix and serving in the American Civil War. So about 250,000 ethnic Irish serve in the Union Army. About 180,000 of them were born here, right? About 180,000 Union guys, and about 20,000 are fighting with the South. So there's a huge disparity. So whenever you're thinking about Irish service in the American Civil War, it's overwhelmingly for the North, for the Union. And the main reasons for that are population, right? So the Irish are poor, they don't have much skills, so they tend to be, although they're very rural in Ireland, they're an urban population in the 19th century United States, and so they go to the major urban centres to work in factories and in low-skilled jobs. And nearly all of those major urban centres are in the states that stay in the Union, right? So that's where they are when the war breaks out. And particularly when I was doing this work in relation to Donegal and the people who were from this county, even more than I imagined, the ties to Pennsylvania just blow everywhere else out of the water, including New York. So for Donegal, really, the story of the American Civil War is the story of Pennsylvania. I'm sure you're all very aware, particularly in the west of the county, of the links that Donegal has with, for example, the Pennsylvania coal regions, the anthracite coal regions, and not to mind Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. And that's a story that Paddy has himself, even though Paddy serves in an Illinois unit. Paddy's links are with Western Pennsylvania. That's why he goes to America. So really, that's the major element of the story. But there's lots of facts that you can bring out about Irish service. So 1 in every 5 men who served in the regular professional Union Army in the American Civil War had been born in Ireland. 1 in every 5 sailors who served in the Union Navy have been born in Ireland. These aren't the ethnic Irish, these are people who've been born there. Huge number of Donegal sailors as well. So we have a total Irish born of 200,000. We'll never know how many of them died, but somewhere based on the numbers that we have for the Confederate and Union dead, between 25 and 35,000 people who were born here died in service. One of the major difficulties we have in relation to the American Civil War is that when people emigrated, number one, they don't come home, usually, to Ireland, right? We have very low return rates. When they're doing anything in their military records, they tend not to say where they're from. So they might say, I'm from Ireland. They might be recorded as being from Ireland. They might live their lives and apply for pensions, and they would never think to say, well, actually, I'm from Donegal, Ireland, or I'm from Leitrim, Ireland. They just say Ireland. So the vast bulk of these tens of thousands of men are lost to us from identifying even the county that they come from, right? But we can identify a good proportion of them to say, we know this person came from somewhere in Donegal. There's thousands of them, a few thousand of these guys we can say came from Donegal, but it's a handful that we can say they came from Arranmore Island in Donegal. So Paddy stands for, there's no doubt that quite a number of people from this island served, almost certainly all in the Union Army, maybe a couple of Confederates, but served in the Union military. So you have to remember that he's like standing for other people here, okay? I started work on the American Civil War, and what I work on is pension files. So many of you might be familiar with, say, our own War of Independence and Civil War, and an awful lot of our pension files of guys who were in the IRA service or whatever are being released consistently now, and they contain a huge abundance of information. Because anyone who is looking to secure a pension, as everyone knows, the state does not give out free money. So you have to give a load of detail about who you were, where you were from, when you were born, all this sort of information. And that's the type of file that I use to try and research people. And the ones that I work on the most are the widows and dependent parents files. So parents who were financially reliant on their sons, or women who were seeking monies because of their husbands who had died in service. And those type of people tend to give more information than others. And this is just an example from Fanet. This is a guy called Hugh Coyle, another Pennsylvania guy. Went out, he enlisted in the 8th Pennsylvania Cavalry. After Robert E. Lee and his army were beaten at Gettysburg, his unit was chasing down Confederates retreating through Pennsylvania. He was captured, sent to Andersonville prison in Georgia, which we'll be hearing quite a bit about later, and he dies there. And his parents in Weena Townland in Fanet asked the American government from that townland for a pension because he was being supported. He was supporting them from there. And in order to prove that they were in dire straits, they included the notice to quit that the 3rd Earl of Leitrim, the famous Lord Leitrim, everybody knows what happened to him. Shiels actually was one of the people who did him in. But anyway, they sent the notice to quit to the American government that they were given to tell them to get off their land, so that the Americans knew how serious it was that they needed this cash. And so this is the type of document you can get that are preserved in the archives in Washington, D.C. A lot of guys gave in original letters, right? So you have huge amounts of these affidavits and everything to prove who people were. And Paddy Nojeen was one of the guys who sought a pension. And so he handed in all this documentation. And so when I was over on a research trip to the United States, it took a few minutes to just pull his file and have a look to see what we could do about reconstructing his story. My primary interest in these files is that they hold the greatest abundance of letters written by illiterate and semi-literate Irish immigrants that exists anywhere in the world. And I've gone through about 165,000 of these files and found about 1,100 letters written by Irish immigrants in the 1850s and 60s. And that's just a map of where everybody was from. I have, for example, in these files, Donegal there, it's actually gone up by 1 since then. I have 7 sets of letters written by immigrants out of Donegal who died in the American Civil War. I won't tarry too long on that, but just to give you an idea of, this is where Paddy Nojeen's file is. We'll be looking at receipts that were signed on this island, and this is where they live, just down the road from Donald Trump, in the National Archives building on Pennsylvania Avenue. I was looking at Paddy's file, I know it's terribly delayed here, in around there. That's the archive room of the National Archives on Pennsylvania Avenue. And to give you an idea of what the file looked like, they've been all properly treated. The National Archives have a massive, this is where the Declaration of Independence and everything is held on display. And they come in the files here that you see, packages of about 60, 80, 100 documents in them, right? So this is everything we're going to be learning about Paddy's details of his life come from that document. Okay, so what do we know about Paddy? Well, we know he's born because he tells us in Afford, that's how you pronounce it, is it? Yeah, close enough. On the 13th of August, 1835. That's what he tells us, he's born. He also tells us he was born in 1834. He also tells us he was born in 1836. And he also tells us he was born in 1838. So this is a very good warning for anybody doing genealogy if you don't have, and such said, he did not know when he was born. He couldn't remember. And this is very, very common in this period because most people are illiterate. And if you are illiterate, it's shown that you don't tend to remember these type of details. You don't kind of know what year you were born. And you also tend to do a thing of rounding up age. A lot of them do it as age heaping. So you can actually look at census information, for example. And if you're illiterate, you're more likely to tell someone that you're 40, 50, or 45, then you're likely to tell them that you're 43, 42, 41. You round things up to close areas because you don't remember, you don't know. Paddy was illiterate, we know that, and we'll be talking about it a bit later on. But he says all of these dates are potentially years he was born. Now, as he was applying for a pension later on, your pension increased the older you were, and you see a lot of 19th century people tend to try and push their date of birth back a bit further and further and further to get them closer to the the age when you get more money, right? But Paddy eventually, in effort to prove his age, sends off for the census, for census information. And this is the 1841 census that is now destroyed. It's gone, doesn't exist. But the National Archives is one of the places where you can get information on it. And he talks, in this census, he was recorded as 6 years old in the townland of Appin. So we know that 1835 is probably the most likely date of birth for him, because he had sent off to prove to the Americans his age so that he could get a pension increase. And he applied for that census detail. Okay? Seamus will be talking, I think, a bit about it, but we think his mother was Paddy Nojeen Gallagher, I think, 1811 to 1890, isn't it? And his father was possibly called Daniel. His mother remarried Paul Jean O'Donnell after his father's death. So that's what the lads tell me anyway, right? Based on your details. At the 1900 United States Census, Paddy was asked, when did you arrive in the United States? And he answered on that he came in 1857. Right? So we know he was born around 1835, and when he was in his early 20s, he went to Pennsylvania. Right? And that's kind of the start of his story in the United States. So this is a map that shows you the areas that are located that we know he was associated with. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, had a sizable Donegal community there. Paddy, in my view, when he goes in 1850s, is going here in this area because this is where he spends most of the decades after the American Civil War, and he spends them with people from this part of Donegal. It's called Walker's Mills. It's a mining place just to the west of Pittsburgh, and almost certainly in the 1850s, that's where Paddy starts off. Right? So Paddy spends a bit of time in Western Pennsylvania, but he somehow finds himself moving out over across Ohio and Indiana into Illinois. In the late 1850s, there was an economic downturn in the United States, and you see a lot of Irish immigrants, particularly young men who were in places like New York and Philadelphia, go west looking for work, and they go west to places like Illinois and are working as farmhands, as laborers, or working as on laboring gangs in that area when the American Civil War breaks out in 1861. Paddy is in this location, that's the distance, a place called Vandalia in Illinois, when the American Civil War breaks out, right? And he decides, for whatever reason, then to enlist in the Union military. This isn't Paddy. This is though another member of his regiment. So this is a guy he served with. He would have known this man. So that's the kind of uniform they were wearing and everything. And this is from Paddy's service record, which I also looked for. Again, if we just had his service record and knew nothing else about him, we'd only know that he was from somewhere called Donegal, wherever that is. So a lot of the times, actually, what you get with this can be very interesting. Is people, these guys, some fella in Illinois who didn't know where Ireland was, is listening to some fella with an Arranmore Island accent, and often you can get something of the Irish pronunciation in the way these people's names are written down. But this is what he was recorded as when he enlisted in what became Company C of the 38th Illinois Infantry. 23 years old, it said. He was 5'7" with a light complexion, blue eyes and brown hair, born in Donegal, was a labourer. He enlisted on the 4th of August 1861 in what becomes Company C. So the 38th Illinois, to give you a bit of background, they were formally organised at Camp Butler in Illinois in September of 1861 under the command of a guy called William P. Carlin, who was an American-born guy. He would become quite well known in the American Civil War. He would rise up through the ranks in that conflict. His first taste of moving on was when they were sent to a place called Pilot Knob in Missouri early in the war. And when they were sent off towards Pilot Knob, they didn't even have guns, right? They were being sent down. The war kind of exploded very quickly in this part of the West, and they were being sent down. They were given their guns en route as they marched down towards the Confederates. But the unit was not an Irish regiment. There wasn't anything really distinctly Irish about it. But the vast bulk of Irishmen who served in the war, they don't serve in units that we know, like the Irish Brigades, like this. They serve in things like the 38th Illinois Infantry. But I had a close look at Company C that he served in when I was looking at Paddy, and it seems that they were very heavily influenced by Irish people, right? They were recruited in Fayette and Champaign counties, but most of them seem to have come from Vandalia, come into the army in the 4th of August 1861. They were recruited by a Frenchman, a guy called Theodore Roderick, but this guy resigns fairly quickly. And the Company C is commanded by 3 more guys during the war. 30-year-old saloon keeper and trader Thomas Cole, who was Irish from County Westmeath. James Mullen, a section boss, who was Irish. And John O'Mara, who was also Irish. So the Company C all through the war is commanded by Irish guys. And Cole, who is Mullen, who's the section boss, I think is the interesting one, because a whole raft of Irish labourers from Vandalia enlist on the same day. So I think that they're probably a labouring gang. They may have been working, maybe bringing coal down the river on the boats. So you became an officer effectively in the American Civil War if you could bring a bunch of guys in with you. You can say, I have 50 guys here who I can bring into the regiment. That's fine. You're the officer. He's brought them all in. So this guy was probably in charge of men like Paddy. And all these other Irish guys, we're going to be hearing from a couple of them later on. And they all enlist together and he becomes their officer. So he's effectively in a strongly Irish company within a non-Irish regiment. Just to give you a regiment at the start of the war was about 800, 1,000 men. A company would have had about 60 to 100 men, right? So that's the type of thing you're dealing with. Right, so Paddy goes off to war. He gets his gun in late 1861, and they do an awful lot of marching. These guys are marching all over Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee. This Western Theater War covers gigantic amounts of ground. So he had pretty sore feet during much of the time he was operating. But his first major taste of action comes at a place called Perryville, Kentucky, where the unit was engaged. There was a big action there on the 8th of October 1862, a big battle. But the regiment wasn't heavily engaged. They come in kind of towards the end of the conflict. The Confederate Army of Tennessee is already on the run. So Paddy's first taste of fighting is effectively running after Confederates. They only lose a handful of men. They captured in that battle an ammunition train, 2 caissons, and about 100 Confederate prisoners. And I think they got a bit of an impression that maybe it isn't too hard war at this stage. When I was looking at Paddy's history in Company C, I came across another man who Paddy would have known. This would have been a friend or acquaintance of his, a guy called James Hayes, who was from Bandon, who also enlisted on the same day, had the same job in August, from Bandon in Cork. And James wrote a letter on the 9th of December 1862 home to his brother. And I'm going to read it out here. This is the first time this will have been read aloud since it was written in 1862, almost, no doubt about it. So this is a friend of Paddy's in the unit, but it gives you a sense in late December 1862 of where things are at for Company C and Paddy. James says, "My dear brother, I received all 3 of your letters, but had no chance to answer them, in account of being all the time marching. I may say day and night, yet we are under strict discipline, as we are the nearest in camp to the enemy. Dear brother, I can hardly tell you as we are going to have any winter quarters at all. We are in readiness and in line of battle every morning at 9 o'clock, with everything ready for any emergency that may occur or approaching threatening moments. But I embrace danger. Dear brother, you have already heard of the Battle of Champion Hill or Perryville on the 8th of October. I was in it, but fortunate for our regiment, we got off with the loss of a few men. I will conclude by wishing all of you a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year." Right, so that's the type of letters that guys are writing back home. Paddy may well have written letters back here but that don't survive. James was writing in other sections of his letter because he was sending money back to Bandon in County Cork so that his mother could emigrate. And his mother did successfully emigrate afterwards with the money he sent, but she never saw James alive again because James was killed in action at the Battle of Chickamauga, where Paddy was captured, which we'll be talking about in a moment. And that's why his letter survives, because his mother gave it in to prove that he had been sending money to her. A man who he certainly knew extremely well. But Paddy's first real taste of the brutality of war comes at this battle. And this is the American Battlefields Trust map of the Battle of Stones River. And we saw in James's letter there, he's talking about, we don't think we're going to get into winter quarters. So these guys are expecting really only to campaign in the summer at this part of the war. But there was a big movement on at the time in Tennessee with the Confederates moving against the Union. And so a massive battle is fought at Murfreesboro, right slap bang in the middle of the state of Tennessee, called the Battle of Stones River, fought over a 3-day period with 2 days of intensive fighting. So to give you an idea of the numbers, the Union come into that battle with about 41,500 soldiers. The Confederates come in with about 35,000 soldiers. 24,500 odd men are casualties as a result of this engagement. The Union forces lose about 1,700 men killed in action. And it's difficult to see, this is obviously a massive map, but the red guys are the Confederates and the blue are the Union. And this battle starts off with a mass Confederate attack, which sweeps into the Union lines here and completely overruns them, right? So this sweeping movement happens. One of the major guys, one guy who has a great reputation, is a guy called Patrick Claiborne, who's from Cork. He becomes the highest ranking Irishman in the American Civil War. Paddy and his 38th Illinois have the misfortune of being here. That's their unit. This massive attack that's sweeping in here, and they're effectively facing the brunt of it. What happens, just to give you a run through of the battle, is the Union are pushed back pell-mell. They keep trying to form defensive lines to here. They eventually hold Phil Sheridan, another Irish American, integral to that. And then a day following, the Confederate attack eventually peters out, although they've really won. But the Union don't leave the field, and they succeed in winning the battle at the end. But to give you an idea of the action in which Paddy was fighting, his first proper battle, this is the report written by his commanding officer. He said, "At daylight, the enemy advanced. Seeing that the troops on the right and left of the line would not come up, I fell back with my infantry on a line with my battery, and I made a stand. The 21st Illinois about 200 yards to the rear, the 101st Ohio to the right, the 15th Wisconsin on the rocks in front of the battery, and the 38th Illinois, who was Paddy, on the left of the 101st. My men were falling rapidly on the front line, and wishing to increase the fire on the enemy, I sent an order to Colonel Alexander to advance and form, and to Colonel Haig of the 15th Wisconsin. To my surprise, I received a reply from Colonel Alexander that he was already so hotly engaged that he could not come forward. This startling intelligence was also communicated to me by one of my orderlies, that all our forces on our right had left the ground. So the 38th Illinois and the other units beside them had been abandoned. There were Confederates lapping in on the right and left. Immediately afterwards, a heavy fire of musketry and artillery from the enemy from my right flank and rear, so the enemy were now behind the 38th Illinois, unmistakably announced that I was attacked from that direction. My command was exposed to fire from all points except the left of my rear, so almost completely surrounded. These guys are all standing in a line, and the only place where they're not taking fire is in this direction. When too late to retire in good order, I found that I was overpowered, and but a moment was wanting to place my brigade in the hands of the foe. I retreated when my horse was shot under me and myself struck. All my staff and orderly dismounted or otherwise engaged, prevented me from communicating orders to the regimental commanders. The 38th Illinois, this is Paddy, held its position until the enemy was within a few steps and then retired. By retired, these guys were not retiring here or in an orderly fashion. They were running in front of the Confederates because they had no choice, and then trying to reform later on. The 38th Illinois, Paddy's regiment, would have suffered far more severely had not a heavy fire from the 15th Wisconsin helped them out. So he goes on about how the regiments were painfully reduced in numbers, but I formed another defensive line way back here and fired several volleys of musketry and artillery, but the foe was still coming on, and with none of our forces at that point to oppose them, I ordered a withdrawal. I retired my command about half a mile to our rear and again tried to rally the men, but it is evident that they were so utterly discouraged that no substantial good could result while no supports were in sight. So that's his first experience of the action, significant action. So his regiment alone there lost 177 casualties. 55 of the men he was serving with died on the field, which is one of the highest rates of death of any regiment in a battle in the American Civil War. But we know that Paddy was conspicuous there because shortly after this, the commanding general brought in a special, if you like, order into the Department of the Cumberland, and it was called General Order Number 19. It was to establish a method of pointing out to the army and nation officers and soldiers of the command who distinguished themselves by bravery in battle, by courage, enterprise, and soldier conduct, and to promote efficiency in the service, that they would keep a roll of honour on which will be entered the names of 5 privates most distinguished for bravery in battle, enterprise, endurance, soldierly conduct, and skill in the use of arms, as selected by the non-commissioned officers and privates, and they shall form a light battalion to be formed from the rolls of honour. This battalion should be provided with the best rifled arms, revolving arms if possible, and will be mounted as soon as practicable. It shall be always kept full by selections made from the brigade, and it would be excused from picket duty, and when not on detached service will be at brigade headquarters. They would be looked upon as the elite of the army and modes for their profession, and from them will be expected such deeds of daring and enterprise as will prove them worthy of the distinction conferred upon them and justify the choice of their companions. And one of the handful of men who were selected for that was Paddy Nojeen, right? So he is selected for that. So he had obviously performed above and beyond throughout this fairly harrowing experience for his regiment as they were pushed from position to position at Stones River. Okay? But his Waterloo comes at this battlefield. It's the battlefield of Chickamauga in Georgia. This is the second bloodiest battle of the American Civil War, although it's not maybe as well known as it should be. Gettysburg is top of that list. Chickamauga is next. It's conspicuous because it's the only major victory that this Confederate army won against the Union army that Paddy was in during the whole war. It was the only time that they really routed them from the field. And it was a 2-day battle, and it was a disastrous experience for Paddy and the 38th Illinois Infantry. It was a battle, we have bigger numbers than Stones River again. 60,000 Union soldiers are brought in, but importantly, the Confederates had been reinforced by men from Robert E. Lee's army in Virginia, and they had 65,000 men. Nearly 35,000 men became casualties during the 2 days of fighting. 16,000 plus of them were Union, and about 1,700 Union men were killed in action on the field. This is the monument to the 38th Illinois Infantry. So Paddy fought in this field on a line of battle here. 33 killed and 183 casualties. They only brought just a little over 300 men into the field, Paddy's unit. But just to give you an idea of the terrain, heavily wooded down here, and what Paddy and his men were doing effectively was defending this road, the Lafayette Road. That monument we just saw, and all these monuments are in line along here. And the Confederates were moving from here in this direction. And the 38th Illinois had the misfortune of coming up against what was regarded as probably the most elite unit, one of the most elite units in the Confederate Army, the Texas Brigade. But just to give you a summary of what happened in this field, the vineyard fields, well, that's the main vineyard field, but these are both parts of the vineyard farm. On the afternoon to the 19th of September 1863, they were deployed in this field in the early afternoon at 2 p.m., lying in the timber to the north of the fields. So along here, all this looks exactly almost as it did on the day of the battle. It's being kept by the National Park Service. They were facing east when they were sent forward with another regiment to support the battery that was located here. They moved into the trees and they began to engage with Confederates at close range. The regiment, so they were in here, Paddy was in here, in this area. The regiment that was here described what they heard coming from the woods where Paddy was. The roar of musketry seemed to be almost constant, sometimes rolling off further to the left, then surging back towards us until it seemed to be at our very elbows, while frequently the crack of cannon by single piece section or entire battery hammered and pounded and shook the very earth, filling the air with shot and shrapnel and bursting shell. Moving on, they ran into the into the Texas Brigade, and according to one of the major historians of the battle, no fighting that day was more bitter or less organised than that around this section of the vineyard farm. So guys can't see 2 yards in front of their face because of the rolling smoke from their fire, but they're getting all mixed up. They don't know what direction they're facing. Really confused, horrific battle. No one could see much beyond his rifle barrel. So the Confederates, who are beginning to push major forces through, begin to again roll up the Union line, who are getting pushed back and back and back. The 38th Illinois are reforming, taking horrendous fire, guys dropping everywhere, moving back defense lines, taking horrendous fire, dropping back again. until eventually they get towards the Lafayette Road, and eventually the 38th Illinois, along with the other regiments, most of them are gone, they break, and according to the words of one historian, the panicked survivors of the 38th kicked and trampled the path through the reserve ranks as the rebels pursued them, right? So they just eventually break. It happens frequently in the American Civil War when guys are in action for a long time. You can only take it for so long against superior forces. So Paddy made it off the battlefield and he survives the day. The Confederates have had a successful first day of the engagement, but they haven't won the battle. But they are shaken, they're broken. Lots of guys are dead on the field. And they're repositioned. So this is where the fighting, this is where Paddy was on the 19th of September 1863. The Confederates sweep through here. They've taken this road. They're in danger of completely annihilating, or at least severely mauling the Union Army. They reform around here, around the hill, and this is the approximate location of Paddy that night. They're put into position here. Really shaky, in really bad condition. And then, this is Little Hill, it's called. At 11:20 the next morning, other units out in front of Paddy were skirmishers. Paddy was on the front line when the Confederates launched another mass attack with no warning. So the first thing that Paddy and his other men in the regiment saw was their own men coming charging back towards their position. They couldn't open fire on the huge number of Confederates behind them because these boys were in front of them. So they had to wait for their own men to jump over the breastworks. Then they were able to fire. The Confederates had this thing called a rebel yell, where they did this kind of whoop, whoop, whoop sound, screaming, a lot louder than I did it there, to terrify the different Union soldiers. They were screaming towards them. The 38th Illinois picked up their guns. They fired one ragged volley, apparently, and then the Confederates were on top of them. And those who didn't break for the rear put up their hands and surrendered. Significant numbers of them surrendered, and one of the people who put up his hands to surrender was Paddy. He was caught in the front line. His commanding officer beside him had been gunned down almost at the start of the fire. Thomas Cole, his captain, who was from County Westmeath, was shot down and killed there. James Hayes, who we heard the letter of from Bandon, was shot down and killed there. Another Irishman he would have known in his unit, 42, these weren't all young men, 42-year-old Arthur McCarthy was shot down and killed there, all in this area around Little Hill. And Paddy surrenders and goes into captivity. And that is when his troubles really start. So Paddy as a prisoner, and again from his file we can reconstruct where he goes. From the 29th of September to the 29th of November. So he's captured on the 20th of September 1863. Earlier in the war, guys exchanged prisoners, the Confederacy and the Union. At this stage of the war, that had broken down. There was no, you were effectively could expect to spend the rest of the war in prison if you were captured at this point in the war. But he's taken first to the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia, which had some notorious prisoner or war camps, pretty bad places. But he was moved in December 1863 to Danville, where another pretty bad prisons were kept. You weren't in the halfpenny place, or you weren't a halfpenny place if you were put into these prisons. But then, early in 1864, he is moved to a place called Andersonville in Georgia, Fort Sumter. Andersonville has a national cemetery in it, where Union guys who died there are buried. And there is no doubt that of all the national cemeteries anywhere in the United States that have Irishmen buried in it, more are buried in Andersonville than anywhere else. More Irish die at Andersonville than in any single battle of the American Civil War. It opened only in February 1864. The place was in operation for only 14 months. And of more than 45,000 men who were imprisoned there, almost 13,000 died. So over 1 in 4 of the men who went into it never came out. It was a 16.5-acre stockade enclosure with no cover given to anybody. It was extended in June to 26.5 acres. A stream ran through the site. It was the only water that was available to the men, but it was also where all their own excrement and everything had to go through. 1 in 4 men died, but if you went into the camp early, your chances of not coming out of it alive went through the roof. And Paddy's unit went into it early. I'll give you a description from another Union veteran. As we entered the place, a spectacle met our eyes that almost froze our blood with horror and made our hearts fail within us. Before us were forms that had once been active and erect, stalwart men, now nothing but mere walking skeletons covered with filth and vermin. Many of our men, in the heat and intensity of their feeling, exclaimed with earnestness, "Can this be hell? God protect us." And all thought that he would bring them out alive from so terrible a place. In the centre of the whole was a swamp, occupying about 3 or 4 acres of the narrowed limits. And a part of this marshy place had been used by the prisoners as a sink, and excrement covered the ground, the scent arising from which was suffocating. The ground allotted to our 90, that's the 90 men of his regiment who were put in there, was near the edge of this plague spot. And now we have to live through the warm summer weather in the midst of such fearful surroundings was more than we cared to think of just then. The map that I've just done of guys in the service, quite a number of them died in Andersonville, the Donegal map. This is a rare photograph of it, so this is what it looked like in the summer of 1864. Paddy could be in that shot. He is certainly in the camp when that photograph is taken. But we have other accounts. So another is Michael Doherty, who's from Falcarra, who is another Pennsylvania man who kept a diary. And this is some of his diary entries. He went on to receive a Medal of Honor later. The 18th of April, 1864, about 500 more prisoners came in today from Cahaba, Alabama. Bernard Toll and Company D died today. 15th of May, 1864. We can see wagons haul away bodies from the dead house like so much dirt. As many as 20 bodies piled on one wagon. Upwards of 1,500 men have died since we came here. 20th July 1864. 130 prisoners died yesterday. It is so hot we are almost roasted, which I always think is a good Irish expression. There were 127 of my regiment captured the day I was, and of that number, 81 have since died, and the rest are more dead than alive. Exposure and long confinement is doing its work among us. Right? So I was interested in seeing how Paddy's unit got on. So I've identified 48 men of the 38th Illinois. That's, by the way, Michael Doherty from Falcarra. 13th Pennsylvania could well have had Arranmore Island men in it as well. It was a heavily Irish cavalry unit. I've identified 48 men of the 38th Illinois who went in to Andersonville. And of the 48 men, 30 of them died. Right? That's a 60% mortality rate of the men who went in out of his regiment into the camp. But what of Company C? Of this largely Irish company, these are the men I have identified, 8 men who went in to Andersonville. 1 was born in England, Isaac Branch, all the rest. There's Paddy and Arranmore, Peter Lynch from Cavan, Michael Kennedy, Kilkenny, John Hester, just identified as Ireland, Patrick Fitzpatrick, Cavan, Owen Healy, Ireland, Michael Jordan from County Clare. And of them, 6 are still at Andersonville today. That's their gravestones, right? So the feat Paddy ever got out of there is quite remarkable. What makes it even more remarkable is that we know that he was put into the hospital in the summer of 1864. And almost nobody who was put into the hospital in Andersonville ever got out of it. Paddy was suffering from scurvy, which was something that killed an awful lot of the men, including some of the men in Company C. He would have known all these men and been around them when they died. He went into the hospital 6 days after Patrick Fitzpatrick died, for example. But somehow he doesn't die. But he seems to have been too ill. So when later in the war, the Union are coming quite close to Andersonville camp, they move a lot of the Union prisoners up into Northern Virginia. Sherman's march to the sea, and this happening at the time, and they move a lot of guys. The only ones who aren't moved are guys who are still in hospital who they think won't make it. Paddy seems to be one of these guys who isn't moved, right? But somehow it must have been pretty tough. He survives, but he had to be carried out on a stretcher and he couldn't walk, he says by his own admission, for months afterwards. And it affected him physically in a way that had lifelong repercussions. Never mind what this did to him mentally, right? So apart from all the horror battles he was in, this must have just taken the cookie altogether. Yeah, it was 3 months before he could walk after he went out. Okay, so, but he survives. And on the 16th of April, 1865, he's taken to Vicksburg, Mississippi, where he's paroled back into Union lines. He then has to do this little bit of a dance to waiting for his discharge. But he's given this. This is his furlough papers after he gets out of Andersonville, which allows him to go to where he wants to go. And it says he's going to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So he's going back to the links that he has in Western Pennsylvania. And he was mustered out of service on the 19th of May, 1865. Okay? So he goes, and we know then he was living in Walker's Mill, Pennsylvania, for most of the decades after the war. He's living there in the 1880s and the 1890s. Other Irish people who were almost certainly from Donegal, when he starts to apply for the pension, start to give applications. So a guy called Owen McGarvey and a guy called Dominic Gallagher are guys he gets to give statements in Pennsylvania for him. So when the Irish go to Pennsylvania, they don't just hang around with other Irish people. They hang around with people from Donegal, and they hang around with people from Donegal who are from the same part of Donegal as them. Right? And these are links that they maintain across decades. Irish people stay in their community groups by and large when they go over. So Owen McGarvey and Dominic Gallagher, these Donegal men, talked about how they'd known him for 33 years, for example. Okay. Just some of the places he was in. This is a map from the Atlantic Carbon Group Limited, but these are the coal mines that Paddy would have been working on, along with colossal other numbers of Donegal men. But we know, because he says he goes for a short time to the Stockton mine, right, and he spends time there. This is the anthracite coal area. This is an area really tight to West Donegal. Like these Schuylkill County, Carbon County, all these areas around here are coal miners, where there's lots of Irish and lots of Donegal Irish. But he says other things. So, for example, he heads out to Colorado, where he's working in this place, a silver mine, Leadville. And he's there during a period of a silver boom in the early 1880s for a few months. Okay, so he's going to places where there's possibilities for him mining. He was probably looking to make a few bob there out of the silver, but he's back within a few months, back living in Walker's Mill. He also apparently spent some time as a railroad worker, he said. Okay, but the impact of what had happened to him in Andersonville during the war were fairly extreme. And so he applies for a pension. And this is incredible when we can see what we see about the survival rate. When he first applies for the pension, he goes to the physicians. They look at him and they say, yeah, he has some recessing of his gums on his teeth from the scurvy that he has. There's a bit wrong with his sight. And they go, but we don't think this guy should get a pension. We don't think he's got enough of the ability, which is quite remarkable. So he's rejected. And so he has to keep applying as the years go on. He's still working in the mines, but eventually he gets it. And then he spends most of the 1890s in these homes. These were homes set up around the United States for veterans of the American Civil War, some who had fallen on hard times, some who were suffering from health issues or debilities. And they're called the National Soldiers' Homes. And he went into the branch in Danville, Illinois, and he was also in this one in near Dayton, Ohio. Okay, so they were the two he was in. That's what they looked like. You had a kind of a military regime when you were in there. You had to kind of wear a uniform when you were in there. They had kind of classes and things like this. And if you left without kind of officially signing out, you were called a deserter, for example. So you mightn't get care in another one if you looked at it. But he spends most of the 1890s there as he continues to suffer, increasingly from being a bit older and from the effects of the war. And we actually have his records at a national home. Patrick Gallagher here. It says all of the enlistment details, 38 Illinois, when he mustered out at the end of the war. He said he had rheumatism, and a lot of people said they had that. His age, 54, all of his different details, what eye color, coal digger, Walker's Mills, Pennsylvania. I always love these. It gives his name and address of nearest relatives. I read one once where he said he hadn't a friend in the whole wide world, is what the guy put in when he got his first entry in. But his cousin, Michael Rogers, 2nd Avenue and Carton Street, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So his cousin. So presumably he's going to be from Arranmore Island, or very close to it as well, right? Rogers. And you see you get information of his date of admission, July the 7th, 1892, date of discharge, March 30th, 1900. He's 8 years in there. He spends another couple of years in another home, and then he comes back here. Almost certainly because he's getting older, with all of the problems he's had, the opportunity comes because his pension, he can afford to come back, and he comes back here to go and live with his sister and to see out his final years in Arranmore Island. And he's in Donegal in and around 1904. That's when he comes back. And he continues to claim his pension when he's here. So that's a big attraction to a lot of them. He's still entitled to his American military pension. This is his pension certificate. So he would have had to bring this anytime he was getting paid. He was getting that check every 3 months off the American government. That seems to have been coming in into Burton Port for him. And he had to do a lot of dealings with the closest US representative to him was the US consul in Derry. So there was a lot of dealing with affidavits. He actually complained that the US consul in Derry was overcharging him at one point, which the consul in Derry defended himself against fairly vigorously to charge. But he comes back and he lives in Carries there. Seamus will talk a small bit about that. But just the type of documents that you get in, these are letters that he wrote from here to the Pension Bureau. So you see Carries, Arranmore, County Donegal, March 4th, 1916. Gentlemen, I'm trying to read this from a very awkward angle now. He's talking here about the paper. He's looking at about his citizenship papers. In this one, right? But you can see he's signing off Patrick Gallagher Company C38 Illinois Volunteers. Another one here where he's talking about making a mistake in filling out the form. I was sworn in Van Daly, Illinois, 4th of August, 1861, for the service of my country, USA. Right. So obviously he did serve. He had every entitlement to say that. But obviously you're putting your best foot forward here. He's writing this letter again early on. I was 2 years in Dayton, Ohio first, then I changed to Danville, Illinois, military home. All these, nearly everything he writes in terms of his recollection number of years is all wrong. And he's saying this as well as he's getting on. He's kind of saying, I can't really remember where I was living and what I was doing for kind of substantial chunks of time. So I think he was having some difficulties around here. But there was one thing I wanted to point out. This is his signature when he first applies for a pension. That's the telltale he's illiterate, right? He says it elsewhere that he's illiterate, but this X. So what you get on these statements is somebody else has written Patrick Gallagher, his mark, X. But that's in the 19th century. In 1908, he can sign his own name. So you have to think about literacy as a moving, and I think almost certainly in the homes in the 1890s, he's taught at least how to sign his own name. A lot of people could read and not write, for example, or read a bit. You know, you were never all of one or all of another. But you get this nice, you can track his signature through the years. So you see that sort of progression. Okay, but some of the other stuff, and all these now preserved just down the road from the White House, which I always think is fantastic. John Sweeney, Burton Port, was the local commissioner of votes. So he must have had a fair trade coming in there from probably everybody on Arranmore used him if they needed a commissioner of votes. Someone who was an official, was allowed to take official statements. All of his credentials went up through the consul in Derry and over to America. They were approved, and so he could act as someone who could witness everything that Paddy did, Paddy said, or that his sister Nora said. And so everything that he sends in are Sweeney and Son, General Merchants, Burton Port, County Donegal. I don't know if they're gone or not or what, but that's lots and lots of stuff in the documentation about that. Again here, Burton Port, County Donegal. And an awful lot of this is to do with Paddy's sister, because if you were an American pensioner, not only were you entitled to a pension, but when you got seriously ill and when you died, the American government would pick up the tab. And so his sister, when he died in 1920, was able to apply for all the medicines that he was given when he was ill. She was able to say exactly how long she nursed him for quite a number of years. She was nursing him. And they talk about how all of his, these are interesting details, all of his medication came from Derry to here. That's where he got his medication from. That was the pharmacists that he used, which I think is an interesting one. We were chatting about it earlier, about the train line up there. That's why he gets it from there and not somewhere else, for example. But it has things like his death certificate. So this is the certification that's in the United States. So Burton Port, in December 1920, Patrick Gallagher, bachelor, 86 years old, pensioner. debility, no medical attendant. There was no doctor on the island for him when he was dying. They have the mark of one of his relatives, his nephew, who was present at the death. Right, so all of this is sent in to prove he was dead. The American consulate has to write and tell the U.S. Pension Bureau that he's dead, so that they stop paying. Right, and so that's his piece. But then you have this. This is from the island. So I actually didn't realise this until the other day. This is from Arranmore, and this is the bill for his funeral. Right, this is the receipt that currently stands. John Sweeney and Son, General Merchants, coffin, 2 shrouds, expenses, weight, £6 of tobacco. Yeah. Bread, sugar, matches, hearse to grave, 4 bottles of liquor, or maybe it's liqueur, is it? It's the same thing anyway. Clothing and coffin, I'm not sure what that says, but you get the whole, all of that is then given, and that is reimbursed by the American government. These are the things I love the most about these, actually. You have them from all over the place. You get a load of these well-preserved early 20th century Irish bills for stuff. Tobacco is massive. I'll read all these letters, and the guy goes, "I do without water before I would do without tobacco." Like they just have to have it in gigantic quantities. Okay, and that's you have letters. So this is Hannah, his sister, talking about them trying to get all this back. So there's letters from her that are written here as well. All of this kind of family history that's poured into the place. All right. Yeah. Well, do you want to do the 2 photos, and then I can just show I'll show the map at the end then. But Seamus, if you want to have a look at just the locations on the island.
So this is an old photo of Mickey Shiels. Can't hear me? We don't have the mic, but I'll speak louder. This is Mickey Vigil's house over by notorious there, below the road. It's closed up now, but this photo was taken a few years back. You can see smoke in the chimney there, supplied by Adrian Begley, sent it on there. You can see Mickey at the time used to keep the hay, cutting that as well. There's a small stack there below beside the buyers. The graveyard photos are he's about halfway up on the old graveyard. His headstone is here. You can't make it out on this one, but his name is written on slate there, just near the bottom of the. There's a couple of closer ones as well. Can't really see it on the screen either. Maybe the next one there, Danny.
Is there a reference to his military service?
No, this is Paddy Gallagher, age, you can hardly see it there, 84 years. Just when he died, but you can see it's hard to make out on the old slate stone, but he's down there anyway.
He's entitled to a United States military headstone that the United States government would pay for and ship for him. Anybody who served, where you can demonstrate service, is entitled to that, which would be a nice thing to have from the end. So, I mean, just for a couple of minutes, because I only officially launched it today, then, is this the map that is a mix of stuff I spent the last 10 years looking at in terms of they call it the colourful circle, yeah. And this the interactive map of the county. So there's about in and around 200 people. So again, I always thought, Paddy is probably representative of quite a number of people from this island who served in the American Civil War. That's the way you have to think about it. It's so rare to be able to locate them. But over the years, I've come across quite a number in the pension files, and I ran an appeal over the last few weeks. And there's in and around 200 entries here of people who are either associated with or served in the American Civil War, who we've been able to locate. Sorry, it's like rolling way too far. But there's 2 on the island. There's another man who we just simply can't locate. We've tried for ages for that to happen. So you get there's Paddy there. So a bit of information about him. He was captured. This is the other one that we cannot find this guy anywhere. It's a problem we were talking about earlier. Like, because so many thousands and thousands and thousands of Irish serve, if your name is John O'Donnell and you don't know where he might have served and it's a bit vague, trying to track these guys down is nigh on impossible. But this is a man who, there's a good local tradition that he served. Apparently also, so far, has taken the name of one of the most famous American Civil War generals, a guy called Black Jack Logan, whose grave I was at in Washington, D.C. quite recently. But some people have even given in photographs and try and find them now. He's a bit further up. So we have photos of some of these men who served in and around the place. So there's a key on it. So the guys with a cross are all the ones who died in service. The guys with a little star are the ones who survived service. There's some who served in later 19th century US military. So the guy outside Donegal at Bustede who died with Custer at the Little Bighorn. A man on Inishowen who died when the USS Maine blew up in Havana Harbor that started the Spanish-American War. One of Bill Hickok's best friends, or Buffalo Bill Cody's best friends up in Inishowen as well, who became very famous. Even down to Cornelia Dare in Glenveigh Castle fame, whose father was a general in the Civil War and was killed, and her first husband died as a result of the American Civil War as well. All those type of links are in there. A couple of generals. There's 3 Medal of Honor recipients. So that's something that you can explore anyway that's gone officially live today for whatever area you may be interested in. Okay, so I think we'll leave it at that. Right. Thanks very much.
Is there just any questions briefly for Damian while he's here? He's come a long way.
I'm interested in the literacy of the people in Arranmore. That was quite, I think it was quite prevalent in most of north of Scotland and Ireland. There were very few people educated. However, Hannah seems to have an education. She wrote letters and seems quite, quite well educated. How did that come up? Did you ever come across the reason behind that?
I've written quite a lot about this. It can be very deceptive because a lot of the people, you didn't have to be literate to write letters. So, and so nearly all illiterate people wrote letters. They just didn't write them themselves. They used, and what I call an amanuensis, they used a middle person. And it's something because I've now looked at well over 1,000 Irish letters, and you frequently come across it. But there is nothing, this is the problem, even if you had a stack of letters at home from the 19th century and you went, oh look, he could write them. There's nothing to suggest that they wrote them. And the only way you will know is if there's like a change in hand that indicates that it's somebody else has changed writing them. You know what I mean? You got one person to write the first letter and somebody else wrote the second one, or if they directly reference it. In the 19th century, everybody was communicating with each other. So people on Arranmore who would have been illiterate would have been receiving letters from their family who were illiterate in Pennsylvania. And it was just being written by somebody else over in Pennsylvania. And here they would have gone, I have this all over, up and down the country. I've actually written about it in a clochan near Letterkenny where they were doing this. And they would have gone to the guy next door or 2 doors up, and they would have gone into his living room and he would have read out, you often hear the American letter, for example. And that's how everybody communicated. But the letters specifically never give any indication that the person isn't writing it. So you have this person who's doing it for them, but it'll still say, for example, Hannah saying, I hope this finds you well as this leaves me at present. Thanks be to God for it. And then a big kind of list of people. So the way the Irish navigated literacy, I think, is really interesting because we did have such high levels of illiteracy, particularly in Irish-speaking areas, because people weren't writing in English, you know. But it ties the community together in a way that just doesn't happen if everybody's literate. Because you're relying on people. You see with money, the money is coming back from America, and if you're not literate, you can't go to the local banking area to get it. You have to get the neighbour who is literate to do it. And so everybody knows everybody's business, but you also have these ties that are binding people together. I've spent a lot of time analysing among the Irish in New York, because I think it does things like, say somebody from an Arranmore community in Pennsylvania, somebody gets killed or something. There's 5 or 6 people who have a kind of an emotional investment in that. If everybody's been reading the letters back from someone, you know them in the first place, that I think gives death and loss a bigger impact than if everybody's literate. I think it's quite significant, but it's a really fascinating topic of how they communicate all the time, even though they can't read or write. So.
Initially, you said that he had joined the military or during the war, enlisted as a laborer. I'm not very familiar with the differences in job titles or what that even means once they're in the military, but later then you had noted that he was actually boatman.
Yeah.
So how did that happen?
He's recorded as both. So that's one of the great things about the military records as well, and their ages can change and everything. But so I think he's recorded as a labourer on the official Illinois musters, like all the other men are recorded labourers, and then on his own, he's recorded as a labourer on one and as a boatman on the other. So labourer was just a generic title for anybody who was doing kind of low menial labouring jobs, who were normally being hired for a couple of days. And I would say that's what he was doing on the boat as well, that he was probably working in that area so that they're linked, you know what I mean? So.
You have about 200 on your list. When you have them forward, I know a lot of them want to do research. Many people keep forward.
Roughly. So people who directly contacted me, maybe about 15 or 20 of them. But one of the tools I did use I went through it all, was Find a Grave. Do you know that website? So I used that quite extensively, looking, because you know the way a lot of people would record where they're from somewhere. So I went through that as well, looking for people. So, like, included in that, there are lists of pensioners in Ireland in 1883 and in 1899, people who claimed pensions in the county. So everybody who back and claimed them, who was there in 1883 or 1899, is on it. People who had come up in pensions, who might have had to, you see, even in a major pension, you will only ever say where you're from in Donegal if you were, say, a parent and you had to say where you were married. So they sent back to Ireland for the parish record of the marriage, or for some other reason if you have to show where you were born. So most of them don't say it. So it's a combination. I went through information wanted ads. So, you know, people who put into the local papers, I'm looking for Paddy Nojeen Gallagher, who emigrated to Pennsylvania in 1857, last seen going west to Illinois in 1860 or whatever, and served in this unit. So, and obituaries in the newspapers, I got a lot out of it as well. But I'm hoping now that it's live, that I'll get a lot more. Like there has to be hundreds where the information is known specifically. There's an awful lot of sets of brothers around the place as well, you know, and I've only got 2 or 3, and I know that there's 4 or 5 of us have served and that type of stuff too.
Sorry, the headstone in Arranmore, that's just a regular, that's not an American headstone.
No, it's just, no. Very few of any of the guys who came back ever got the American military headstones. So I think it's a good opportunity to do it, because, you know, you could have a bit of a thing around it to have that kind of an event for him.
Paddy's in the same grave as his sister and his sister's husband, Hannah, is in the grave as well.
I'd say they'd all be pretty happy if we got things in our communications.
It says something that he survived Andersonville and still lived to 86, right?
Yeah.
Oh my God, what a tough
Yeah.
man he must have been.
Yeah. I often did the difference of, say, living here And as you were saying earlier, like the difference even when he came back from when he left, you
Yeah.
know, how many people would have been gone and everything, all the different places. But then what you've seen, like you're a long way from the woods of Georgia and the stockade, and you're down on the coast. Actually here, it's incredible to think. But I think it is unfortunate that they are practically forgotten. Like, there's really very little has ever been done, even to try and find out more about them or to discuss them. Okay.
It's fantastic, Tyler.
Thank you very much, Damian.
Cheers.
Thank you.